Well, good morning, and let me welcome you again to Westminster Presbyterian Church. For those of you I haven't had an opportunity to meet yet, my name is Luke Phillips, and I always like to say that I will be right back here at this door after the service, and I would love nothing more than the opportunity to greet you personally and get to know you before you leave today, so please make sure you stop by. Over the past several weeks, we've been in this Profiles in Transformation sermon series, all about some of the kings of the Old Testament. And we started out with David, and then we heard about Solomon, and then we're all the way down 300 years later. Today we come to Josiah, the young king who became the king at only the age of 8 years old. So we're going to be reading a little bit about Josiah in 2 Kings chapter 22, verses 1 through 13. I invite you to read along with me, although I'm going to be reading from the ESV because it can fit in my pocket. And I'm going to skip some of these names just for sake of time. So join with me as I read. It says, Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem. And he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord, and walked in all the way of David his father, and he did not turn aside to the right or to the left. In the 18th year of King Josiah, the king sent his servant to the house of the Lord, saying, Go up to Hilkiah the high priest, that he may count the money that has been brought into the house of the Lord, which the keepers of the threshold have collected from the people. And let it be given into the hand of the workmen who have the oversight of the house of the Lord. And let them give it to the workmen who are at the house of the Lord repairing the house. That is, the carpenters and the builders and the masons. And let them use it for buying timber and quarried stone to repair the house. But no accounting shall be asked for them for the money that is delivered into their hands, because they deal honestly. And Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the secretary, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah the priest gave it to Shaphan the servant, and he read it. And Shaphan the servant came to the king, Josiah, and reported to the king, Your servants have emptied out the money that was found in the house, and have delivered it into the hand of the workmen who have the oversight in the house of the Lord. Then the secretary told the king, Hilkiah the priest has given me a book. And he read it before the king. When the king Josiah heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes. And the king commanded Hilkiah the priest and many others, saying, Go, inquire of the Lord for me and for the people and for all Judah concerning the words of this book that has been found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us, because our fathers have not obeyed the words of this book, to do according to all that is written concerning us. May God bless to us this reading from his holy word. And so for us to really understand what is going on with Josiah here, we have to have a little bit of perspective. We have to put it a little bit into context. For the past 300 years before he became the king, it's been nothing but problems. And those problems began when the nation of Israel split. So there was the King David, and then there was Solomon, who we heard about several weeks ago. And right after Solomon died, the nation of Israel split between the northern kingdom, which was 10 tribes in the north called Israel, and the southern kingdom, which is the tribe of Benjamin and Judah in the south, and that was called Judah. Well, the first and second Kings, it goes through and it tells us all about all of these different kings all the way over these past 300 years. But for our purposes today, we're thinking mostly about just the southern kingdom of Judah. That's the kingdom that Josiah was the king over. And for all of these years, it's been nothing but problems. It started when they stopped living in community with each other. They stopped living in community with each other. As a matter of fact, how could they possibly live in community with each other when there's a kingdom in the north and a kingdom in the south? And not only that, the place that they used to come together into the temple where they would have a communal prayer and where they would offer sacrifices together on the altars, that over these 300 years had been turned into a place filled with pagan gods and pagan priests and prostitutes, and it was blanketed all over the land of Judah and in the temple. Not only were they neglecting to have community with each other, but they weren't having community with the one true God. They couldn't even get into the temple without passing by horses who were lined up to be sacrificed to the sun god. And not only that, there was another idol that they had, and this is probably one of the most evil ones that they ever came up with. It was called Moloch. And Molech was this gigantic idol made out of metal. And it had a hollowed out interior, and Molech, this image, would sit with its hands in its lap, with its legs at a right angle. And they would come into that hollow interior, and they'd fill it up with wood and fuel, and they'd light it up as hot as they possibly could. And they would keep that fire going for hours and hours, sometimes days, until the whole lap of Molech was a bright red, like an oven. And then they would take infants and babies, and they'd offer them on the lap of Molech. So this just gives you an idea of what Josiah is dealing with as he becomes the king of Judah, and it happens for the whole first 18 years of his reign. So there's no doubt that as we approach this scripture today, that they are living in a place outside of community with each other, and they're living outside of community with the one true God. And so we have a little bit of the beginning of the story of Josiah in those days of Israel. But now I would like to turn our attention a little bit to the Corinthians in the days of Paul. Earlier in our service today, we heard a little bit from 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And what I'm going to suggest is that the Corinthian church at this time, they are very similar to the nation of Israel in the days of Josiah. They are living outside of community with each other, and they are living outside of community with the one true God. We know that they're living outside of community with each other because why else would Paul have written this letter? As you read through it, basically what happens is he got word that they were fighting, that they were constantly quarreling, and that they were on the brink of completely spreading out the church so that it would be no more. They were not in community with each other. Another thing that you have to realize about the Corinthian church is that back in those days, Rome was the government, and Greek was the culture. And it started right there in the very epicenter of Greece, there in Corinth. And the culture would spread out to the ends of the earth from Corinth. It was a culture of immorality, a culture of violence. And their only concept of God was gods like Zeus, who they would claim to be the god of gods, this Greek mythology, or Aphrodite, or Apollos. Some of them, you could take your pick. Some of them were half human and half God. Some were completely God. Some were half animal and half God. That was their concept of gods in Corinth. And so as these problems arose, they started to get really focused on their problems. And it's no wonder they had a hard time worshiping the one true God. Paul tells us about, by name, several people that would come into the church and they would preach a false doctrine. They always had these distractions. They weren't in community with each other, and they weren't in community with the one true God. And so what I would suggest today is maybe, just like Israel in the days of Josiah, and just like the Corinthian church in the days of Paul, that maybe you're here today and you're facing some problems. Like I said earlier, you either just came out of one, you're in one right now, or you're just about to be in one. We all have problems that we face all the time. And we could think about some of those together today. We are in a recession after all. Maybe at one point you were living within your means, and then now suddenly you're not living within your means, now that we're in this recession. It's also a time of transition for all of you. Some of you are students, some of you are parents or grandparents, and school is starting up, and there are all kinds of changes, and with change there comes all kinds of problems. I see some of you smiling because you know exactly what I'm talking about. And there are all kinds of things. Maybe it is that you're facing a life-threatening disease today, and it's affected you and your family and the comfort of all of your friends. We all face problems every day. And I know that one thing that I do when I'm faced with a problem is sometimes I start to push away the people that care about me the most. I start to push away my community. About 2 weeks ago, I went down to, flew all the way over to North Carolina. That's where I'm from. You can probably tell by my accent. I went to North Carolina, and then we went down to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, me and my family. And so I went there for no other reason but to spend time with my family and to take my vacation days. And so while I was there, I got a phone call one morning, like 9 a.m. or something like that, and it was just a little bit of a problem. So minute that it doesn't even matter that I tell you what the problem was. But I remember hearing about this problem. The first thing I did was I said, hey, Mom, Dad, brothers, I'm just going to go sit on the beach by myself for a little while. And so I went out and I sat there, and I almost immediately, as soon as I sat down, started thinking about my problems and started getting into this mindset of woe is me and doom and gloom. I almost immediately had to smack myself in the face and slap myself out of it. I had to come to realize that what I had been doing is, once I was presented with a problem, I was secluding myself from my community and the people who care about me the most. I think often that's what we do. Often we are presented with a problem in life, and the first thing we do is we begin to push away our community with others. People will come and say, hey, what's going on? What's wrong? And you say, oh, don't worry about it. I'm fine. Don't worry. Everything's okay. We start to seclude ourselves. Another thing that I do when I'm presented with a problem is I start thinking about the particulars, and I start to think about how I could solve this problem. All the specific things that are going on with this problem, and I start to get my focus right here on those things, and after a while I realize that my focus has been here so much that no longer am I focusing my attention on the one true God. So often we're very similar to the Israelites and to the Corinthians in that way. About 2 years ago, back in 2008, I bought a motorcycle. And this was no ordinary motorcycle. This was a 2003 Honda CBR 954 RR, like a 954, the really, really fast ones. And this bike was one of the fastest bikes you could get at the time. It's really light, but has a really big engine, so it goes really, really fast. It's the really scary kind that they pass by you on the freeway all the time. And it's really loud, and I was that guy. And so I was down here, and you always had to ride it like this, and it was really, really uncomfortable. It's not those cruiser-style bikes where you sit back and you just chill back there on their comfortable seat and you just cruise around town going really slow or whatever. This is one of those really, really fast ones. But man, it really hurt when you're down in that seat like that for a really long period of time. And so for a while, I realized that I could save a little bit of gas if I drove my motorcycle to school. I was going to the University of South Florida, and I lived in Dunedin, Florida, so it was about 30 miles away, and I realized I could save some money. So I would start riding, and I was going on this 30-mile drive like twice a week on this motorcycle, and man, it hurt so bad. I would be down, and as soon my arms, my legs, my back, my neck, everything would start to hurt. Well, then I would just kind of adjust a little bit. I'd start to sit up for a second, and then the pain would suddenly go away. But then a few minutes later, the pain came back, and it was worse than it was before. And so all the way on this journey to the University of South Florida, I started thinking to myself, don't worry, Luke, just keep making adjustments. And soon you're going to be there at your final destination. I think that's really similar to what was going on with Josiah in his days as the king of Israel. They were constantly being hit with hurt and pain, and they were just constantly making adjustments. But the problem was they had neglected to remember their final destination. And so what happens is, we all know the story that we just read a few moments ago, how he says, in one moment he has this idea. He says, hey, to my servant, go down to the temple, and I want you to give them all the money we have. Let them start restoring the temple. And while they're restoring the temple, Hilkiah, the priest, finds a scroll, and it gets back to Josiah, and they unravel the scroll, and they read it to him. And it was the book of Deuteronomy, the last book of the Pentateuch. And he read it, and it's no wonder he ripped his clothes. Because if you understand the book of Deuteronomy, it was a time when Moses was writing a list of do's and don'ts for the Israel people right before they were just getting ready to enter into the promised land. And for all this time, they had been living in a kingdom of doom and gloom, a kingdom in the wilderness, a kingdom of woe is me, a kingdom of negativity. But then he writes these do's and don'ts and these things with a little bit of a sense of excitement, because they're just getting ready to go over Jordan. They're just getting ready to be in the promised land. And so Josiah reads this for the very first time, and this tells you how bad Israel was. They haven't had the scriptures in hundreds of years. They uncover it in the temple. He reads it for the first time ever, and he rips his clothes because he was realizing in that moment that his kingdom that he had established for himself, that it was one of living in the wilderness. Living in a world of negativity, in a world of problems, doom and gloom. Woe is me. And he realized that at that moment, he had the power to restore Israel and to take it back to being a land that was headed toward milk and honey. He would bring it back to a land where they were living in the promised land here and now. This is similar to what happened in the Corinthian church. Paul, the person who wrote that letter to the Corinthians, he was no stranger to transformation himself. You see, he wasn't always called the Apostle Paul. He was once known as Saul of Tarsus. And he was, by profession, a tent maker, but that wasn't his passion. His passion was his religious practice. And he was a Jew of the Jews. He was a Pharisee of the Pharisee. He was the best and the brightest that they had ever seen and that they would ever see. And he had made it his mission to stamp out the cult of Christianity. He believed that anyone who said that this person named Jesus was the Messiah they had been waiting for, that they deserved to die. Anyone who said that this Jesus was the Christ, the Son of God, they deserved to die and be persecuted. He would do whatever it took to stamp out this cult. And then one day, he was on his way to Damascus with decree in hand to continue persecuting Christians, and suddenly there came a blinding light from heaven, and the voice from God said, "Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And it was in that moment that his life was completely transformed. And so as he's writing to these Corinthians in the Corinthian church, he's realizing that they're living outside of community with each other, and they're living outside of community with the one true God. And he recalls a time in his life when no one wanted to be around him at all, when he was living outside of community with everyone else. He recalled a time in his life when he was living outside of community with the one true God. And so he hears about the quarrels that are going on and what's going on with the Corinthians at this time, and he realizes that they are doing the same thing that he was so long ago. And so I'm going to read a brief portion of what we read earlier today. This is in his 2 Corinthian letter, and it's in chapter 5. He says this, "For we know that if the tent," remember he was a tent maker, "which is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling. If indeed by putting it on we may not be found naked, for while we are still in this tent we groan being burdened. Not that we would be unclothed, but that we would rather be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up with life. He who has prepared us for this very thing is God, who has given us the Spirit as a guarantee." And so he's writing to this Corinthian church, realizing they're living outside of community with each other and with God. And the first thing he says to them, he says, look, you need to stop living for the kingdom of the wilderness. You need to stop living in this kingdom of doom and gloom. You need to stop thinking about, woe is me, everything is bad. Stop focusing on your problems. And you need to start to realize that in this moment, your lives could be completely transformed. And it's time for us to start thinking about the land of milk and honey across Jordan. And we need to start living as if it weren't some far and distant land, but as if it were right here, right now. There was a country man who lived out on a farm, and he had this beard, really long beard that he liked to grow, and he always wore his overalls every day as he worked out on the farm. And he had a little son named Billy, and Billy had dirt on his face and rags and tatters for clothes, and he always walked around in his bare feet. And then there was the mother and the wife, and they lived together happily on the farm. Well, they had never been to the city before. So they decided that they were going to take a trip to the city for the very first time. And so they pack up their things and they get on their way. And as they arrive in the city, they look, and there is this gigantic building. And they have never seen anything like it before. So they begin walking up the steps looking a little bit suspect, and they open up the door and they peek in and they peer into the lobby, and they're just awestruck by this gigantic building that they'd never seen before. Well, the mother needs to go to the restroom, so she heads off her own way. And so there is standing in the lobby of this gigantic building in the middle of the city, a man with his overalls and his scruffy beard, and a little boy with his rags, tatters, bare feet, and dirt on his face. Well, not long after that, they're watching, and here they look over and they see that there's this thing called an elevator. They've never seen anything like that before. And they watch and it lights up, and then every once in a while they keep hearing this sound, ding. After a while there comes an elderly lady, and she has her hand on her back as she's walking with the cane. And she goes walking into the elevator. And they look with awe. They're just like, what's going on here? Well, the elevator door opens, she walks in, it closes, and they hear the sound, ding, and then they see the lights doing different things, and then all of a sudden it stops, and then a few seconds later, the lights start doing something again, and all of a sudden they hear the sound again, ding, and the elevator door opens, and out walks the most beautiful woman they had ever seen, and their eyes get really big, and their jaw drops to the floor. They cannot believe their eyes at this transformation that just happened. And so she walks by the man with his scruffy beard and his overalls on. He looks over at Billy with his dirt on his face and his t-shirt and bare feet. And he says, "Hey, Billy, go get your mom. She's going in there next." You know, if only transformation could be that easy. If only you could just walk in and walk right out and everything would just be fine. Well, often it's not like that. Often it's not something that takes place right here, right now. Often, transformation is the kind of thing that it's a journey that we can begin, that you could begin today. And it's a journey that will last for the rest of your lifetime, this process of transformation. And so it is that there's no doubt we all have problems. And hopefully by this point today you've thought a little bit about what your problems are, or what they could be in the future. We all have problems, and we have a choice to make. Either we can live in the kingdom of doom and gloom, woe is me, and focus on our negativity, or we can begin living for the kingdom of God, for the land of milk and honey. And when you have a really good understanding of what heaven really is, it's a place where we live in community with each other, and we live in community with the one true God. And so it is that we are on this highway of life, so to speak, and there's always going to be hurt. And you're always going to have to continue making adjustments throughout your life. But let us never neglect to remember to do it in community with others and community with God, never forgetting our final destination. Let us pray. God, we come before you today humbled, understanding that we all have problems. That's life. The problems are never going to end. But you are a God who can turn Saul, the murderer, into Paul, the messenger. You're one who can come and transform our lives right now. And you can begin us on a journey of transformation that will last for the rest of our lives. Let us not focus on a world of woe is me. Let us not live in the wilderness. But let us take a lesson from Israel in the days of Josiah and the Corinthians in the days of Paul. And let us put those things aside. Let us not be distracted. Let us be like Josiah, who didn't go to the left or to the right, but stayed straight ahead. We will give you all the honor and praise and glory that you deserve. Amen.